Good afternoon. I'm Bill Eisler. I'm a member of the advisory committee and serving as a liaison. Just to introduce the moderators of the event of the panel. Just a few things. There are QR codes on either side. If you would like to ask any questions of the panelists, please use the QR codes. David, who is moderating the panel, will be able to pull them up on the iPad. I want to welcome all of you here in person and everybody who is attending via live stream. It's going to be a great session, and I turn it over to the moderator, David.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm David Gartenstein-Ross. I'm the founder and CEO of Valens Global, and it's great to be with all of you to have this conversation. We have a great panel here. There's one more person who will be a little bit late because she was double booked, but you've got a lot of wonderful experts who can speak about the issue of taxonomy. To introduce this and to show why it's important to all of us and to the summit, I want to read the initial write-up that we received about taxonomy to frame the panel. And it is one critical impediment in the anti-hate field is that there is no consensus on the meaning of the fundamental terminology. This panel will review the competing definitions and develop a working group to adopt the terminology that the summit will use going forward. It seems to be an ambitious goal, but we'll take it in an interesting direction here. We're going to begin with Dr. Jim Marley. I want to turn a first question to Jim. He is an associate professor at Loyola University Chicago School of Social Work with over 30 years of experience working with people with severe mental illness and their families. And I want to start at the meta level, not to be confused with the company. But what is the importance of taxonomy? Why does taxonomy matter?
That's a great question, and thank you all. I just want to first just thank all of you for showing up to what is probably the panel with the least sexiest name in the entire conference. So hopefully that says something about the audience here and their interest in this kind of arcane, potentially obscure world of taxonomy. Within taxonomy, it's really, as was said, trying to identify language, the power of language, the power of words. And in professional work, taxonomies oftentimes allow people that are doing work in similar fields to share kind of a common vocabulary, a common language. And those words can take on a tremendous amount of power and importance depending on which words you use, which words get left out in the development of taxonomy, what those different words mean. And with the idea of confining it to the conference and thinking about how this field uses so many terms, even if you look at like broad terms like terrorism prevention, violent extremism, countering violent extremism. There are so many different 2- and 3-letter terms that get tossed around, yet in some ways those terms share similarities but also have some differences and have different implications for the terms that you use. So within a field of trying to understand a phenomenon and how to sort of address that phenomenon, having some agreement potentially around what it is we're talking about when we talk about something, which I know sounds very vague, but having a shared vocabulary, even if it's just around the people participating in this conference, and being able to know that when I use a term and I'm speaking to someone else at this conference, that they'll know what I mean, what the import of that word is, that language that we're using, and we'll be able to have a shared conversation without having to go into a lot of backstories explaining what we do. That's the benefit of a taxonomy, is to some extent taxonomy allows for conversational exchanges among people who understand that vocabulary. Now, this is also a global summit, and so I think we'll be talking a bit about what's the difference between people coming from different parts of the world who may share a different taxonomy or different way of understanding the words. The other thing I just want to raise about the potential benefit of taxonomy is when words are used to define a phenomenon. I know I spend a lot of time in parts of my work trying to make sure people understand what a taxonomy is and what it is not. Because sometimes taxonomies take on a life of their own. The easiest thing I can compare it to is I've spent a great deal of my life in the area of mental health, and there's this little thing called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a huge taxonomy. And the dilemma is, over time, some of that taxonomy has gotten lost. People begin to interpret some of that language as meaning it predicts how you're supposed to treat a problem. It predicts the cause of a problem, when really that's not what it is. But it takes on those facets. And when you think about terms like targeted violence or violent extremism, hypothetically, if one of those is like the term, it's also important to think that if you use like a term like violent extremism, that term itself is not saying anything about cause. It's also not saying anything about what to do about it. And that's okay when it comes to taxonomy, because it allows for different approaches to understanding cause and different approaches to what to do about it. But there is a danger around finding the right word or the right term, where people outside who don't necessarily understand the role of that word can begin to give it different kinds of importance that it really does not have and was never meant to have. So I toss that out there as kind of a cautionary piece, that as this working group and perhaps you all weigh in on how we use language and the power of language, that we also understand that there is some obligation to use it wisely and to not have it move beyond the scope that it's really intended to do, which is really to define a phenomenon without necessarily pressing a point about a particular cause or a particular response to that phenomenon.
Thanks, Jim. That's a great introduction to what taxonomy is and why it's important. I'm going to turn to Richard in a second, then I'm going to turn to Brett about some of her experiences within government and taxonomy employed within the U.S. government. But I'll say that my background is working in the field of terrorism studies, one could say, as an analyst and a scholar. And one thing that's often said about terrorism is there's no consensus definition of terrorism. And which is completely true. As I worked towards my PhD, I became less impressed by this fact, because I realized that there was no consensus definition of almost any concept I ever worked with. There's no consensus definition of war, of civil war. There's no consensus definition of social science. There's not even a consensus definition of the word definition. So that being said, what I want to turn to Richard Aborn on is some of the perils, perhaps, of a search for an elusive consensus definition. Richard is the president of the Citizens Crime Commission of New York City, which does some remarkable work. And among other things, one thing that he has been involved in is pro-gun control work. And in that area, there's been a search for consensus terminology that, as we were talking, Richard, you found has sometimes been counterproductive. So I thought that could be a good place to anchor our cautionary tale.
Sure, actually it is a good place, and I join Jim's thanks to all of you for coming to this ridiculously complex conversation. It's a bit like a circle and a spiral, if you remember that famous phrase. I come to the table as an advocate, a person who pushes for different sorts of remedies to try and reduce violence in all of its various forms. But I did spend a good part of my career in the gun control movement in the United States. I actually helped build that and then ran it for well over 10 years, and ran it when we were moving legislation through Congress, the Brady Bill, the ban on assault weapons, the ban on large magazines, et cetera, and also set up an entire arm of the movement to do non-legislative interventions. And I want to use the gun control movement as an example of where this can become perilous, and then just offer some suggestions. So the gun control movement, and I'm saying gun control on purpose, has been on a 2-decade search now for what is the right term. Is it gun control? Is it gun safety? Is it gun violence reduction? Is it fewer guns? What is it? And every time the movement tried to find that term, it ran into the peril of violating the Voltaire principle. We were letting the perfect chase out the good. And what was the net result? We would confuse our supporters. We totally confused the press, because the press after a while started saying, well, you're talking about gun control, I guess you're not talking about gun safety then. What's the difference? Well, there was no difference. We were talking about gun violence reduction. Well, they said, well, then you're not talking about legislation. Well, yes, we are, because we're talking about gun control and controlling. You see, it just becomes a circumlocution. You just keep getting into this myriad of issues over this terminology. So I think one of the maxims I think about, and I said in our previous call, which I don't think you made, is that the first rule in my mind in the taxonomy discussion is do no harm. Sound familiar? Is do no harm. Because the thing you don't want to do is you don't want to lose people because of this desire to have a very esoteric, precise definition. The second rule I think about, and Brett talks a lot about this and quite effectively, and I'm sorry, I'm going to steal a speck of this because it fits, is think about who you're trying to reach, right? So if you're trying to reach a psychiatrist or a medical doctor or a social worker or a psychologist, yes, you need a precise diagnostic phrase. But if you're trying to reach the general public, you may not need that level of precision. I'll give you an example. There's a fairly large debate in this space, believe it or not, around the term terrorism. The debate centers around two things. One, must terrorism be ideologically driven and sow terror in the population? Or can it just sow terror in the population, even if it's not ideologically driven, and therefore still be considered terror? Now, there are legal implications to that, because the body of law that you trigger when you talk about terrorism is quite different than when you talk about non-terroristic acts. Yeah. But to take that deeper, that body of law differs whether you're talking about international terrorism or domestic terrorism. So in this case, and I think for the public, I think the public knows when an act of terror occurs. It's a little bit like, was it Brandeis's definition of pornography?
No.
Who was it? Who was it?
It was not
Potter
Brandeis.
Stewart.
Yeah.
Right?
Potter, it was
Potter Stewart.
In a famous pornography case, one of the Supreme Court said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. It's like terrorism. People know it when it is. So yes, we can try and get a precise definition, but you're going to lose some people in the process of doing that. So that's another maxim I follow in this space. And the third is what I started with, is don't let the perfect chase out the good. If we come up with good definitions that you pick your number, 70, 75, 80% of the people know what you're talking about, that's good enough, because you're never going to get 100% of the people, because the audiences you're trying to reach with a single word are always going to be multifaceted. So let me leave it with those sort of maxims swirling around, and then see if we can't get deeper into what would be a good taxonomy.
Yeah, and I think that we even have some answers up here. We'll get to them shortly. And might talk, if we have an agreement, we might talk about how to implement them. But first, I want to anchor on the problem just a little bit more by turning to Brett Steele. Brett is legendary. She is the Director of Prevention and National Security at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. She previously did a great deal of prevention work at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and I first got to know her when she was still at DOJ, right? And served as the Deputy Director of the U.S. Countering Violent Extremism Task Force. So with a distinguished career in government prior to going to the McCain Institute, what I wanted to ask is, you're dealing with topics where there are different definitions, even among different departments. Was this a problem, or was it something that you were able to navigate effectively, or both?
A little of both. So one of the challenges, especially when trying to craft the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, was we were trying to bring departments and agencies that historically hadn't been a part of this work and hadn't recognized a role in this work to the table. And those included the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Labor. The Department of Homeland Security, FBI, Department of Justice, National Counterterrorism Center, they all understood the role that they could play in this work. But it wasn't until we learned the language to talk with the Department of Health and Human Services that they began to take us seriously. So it wasn't until we could ask them, okay, help us understand protective factors. How do we actually reduce the risk that an individual may turn violent? It wasn't until we could look at that public health model that they had for violence prevention more generally and say, okay, help us understand where that line of secondary prevention is versus tertiary in this context. And let's look at some specific case studies that they actually came to the table and engaged with us more directly. Because there was about a year where they would come to meetings because they were required to come to meetings, but they didn't really understand why they were there. And it's not their fault. We weren't talking their language. So it was a challenge in that we had to learn the terms that would resonate for them. But once we did that, we could find that common language. And I can't tell you, I look at Humera because she's been in this field for longer than I have. And, you know, there were plenty of times where we were like, okay, let's not get into the definitions discussion because that'll just consume all the oxygen and we'll never get to the work. So you have to find that balance of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, but at the same time finding the terminology that will resonate such that you bring the right partners to the table.
And I think that's an important lesson and one that goes to, I think, where we are heading in terms of solution, which is that it's not about having a consensus definition. It's about being able to speak the same language and use terminology in a way that other people are able to understand, or in a way in which you're able to have a common discussion. And this is where we integrate in Björn Iller. Björn is the co-founder and director of the Khalifa Iller Institute and co-founder and co-CEO of Glitter Pill. He's an internationally renowned researcher and expert in countering and preventing radicalization into violent extremism. And before the panel, what we were talking about is two different models for dealing with definitions. One is the model I think that we're all gravitating away from, which is the elusive search for universally recognized definitions. Another model that Björn talked about, pointing to a couple of recent works that have been published, is that of matrices or visualizations of multiple terms that may be applied to a problem or multiple definitions that may be employed by different organs looking at it. And Björn, why don't we start our leaning into the solution with your observations in this regard?
Yeah, so I think there's several kind of elements to finding definitions that are applicable in different settings, right? One way of going about it would be, we know it when we see it, which is deeply problematic from kind of a human rights perspective in some contexts where, for instance, a vague definition of violent extremism can be used to repress freedom of expression. And so there's dynamics that needs to kind of be at play when it comes into legislation, but also when it comes into issues like content moderation. And so I've worked with the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism in helping out in developing their framework, definitional in capacity of working with the independent advisory committee there. And so that's kind of one element of where I'm coming from here, looking at how can we create a behavioral framework, really, which looks at beyond the surface level of ideology that would tend to kind of fall into to some extent, At the same time, I also have a background of having worked with the UN. The UN has 380 different definitions of terrorism in itself, I think, and so violent extremism has even more than that at this point. And one of the issues we were trying to tackle there, I was chairing a working group on youth peace and security and youth efforts to counter extremism back in 2016 when I was younger than now. One of the things that we found challenging there was, first of all, there's so many definitions already. We don't really want to reinvent the wheel necessarily, or like necessarily contradict all of those either. But we want to find something that we can all have as a base level and work from in order to advocate for better policies in order to counter extremism. And so it needs to be universally applicable across the world. Like that's problematic in itself because the world is vast and diverse. And then it needs to be impossible to use it in order to abuse human rights. And so it needs to have that built into the definition itself. And then it needs kind of all of these other things. And so part of what I suggested earlier before the panel, I should probably have suggested that on the panel, and so I am now, is looking at the definition perhaps from the perspective not only of how do we define extremism or terrorism or hate or whatever it is that we're trying to define in the first place, but also what needs are we trying to fulfill by defining it and for whom. Like a legal system will have different requirements for what they actually need within a definition than, for instance, an organization like the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which again has a different need than a group like the working group within the UN that I was working at, which has a different kind of need than the work that I'm doing in the Khalifa Ayler Institute and Glitter Pill, which uses the definition I mentioned earlier as the violent denial of diversity. And so kind of looking at all of that, it is important to also think of it from an application perspective. And so I think like in a lot of the discussions on taxonomies and definitions as well, we tend to climb up into our ivory tower and put our heads in the sky and forget about the on-the-ground impact of the definitions. And kind of starting there might be a better idea. There's kind of a third or fourth, I don't remember how many examples I've been at this point of where definitions really matter, and that is from an impacted person perspective. I'm a survivor of the terrorist attack in Norway in 2011, and to me it matters to call that a terrorist attack. It was not prosecuted as a terrorist attack because Norway didn't have legislation to prosecute terrorism that looked lone wolfish and domestic at the time, similar to issues with legislation here. And so from a survivor perspective as well, it matters for recovery, for mental health, for acknowledgement of what the issue is, for getting access to mental health resources and all of these things that are needed for survivor communities and affected communities after attacks to have a definition. At the same time, also having spoken to survivors, for instance, from the shooting in Las Vegas, it's very hard to find a definitional difference from the perspective of someone who was on the ground there. And my own experience being on Utøya Island in 2011, we were both running from people shooting at us. What the people who were shooting at us were thinking about mattered less to us at the moment. And so figuring that out as well adds to the challenge. But perhaps starting then with what are the needs of the people who needs a definition in the first place is the way to build up towards where we want to end up.
It's very helpful, and thank you for sharing your experience there. One thing I should point to is that there is a QR code over there, and those who are interested in submitting questions for the panel can use the QR code. But so Björn, the overall observation you're making is that for one thing, you might choose a definition based on the needs of people involved. Now, to anchor kind of our own search for a definition, I think we can look at this as having overlapping levels, right? Ultimately, Eradicate Hate's first point of interest is for the summit itself. Having a taxonomy that we employ in order to make the summit effective at advancing its mission. And so within the look at needs, one thing that we all were discussing prior to the beginning of the panel is that perhaps it's not the search for a singular definition, but to have multiple definitions. Björn had spoken to how both GIFCT and the non-governmental organization, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, had put together a couple of documents that are interesting. One of them looks almost, the ISD's document looks almost at frameworks for understanding based on multiple terms or definitions employed. GIFCT provides multiple different national level definitions. And so, Jim, with your excellent introduction on taxonomy, what I want to turn to is perhaps this the solution for our working group in trying to form a taxonomy. Might it make sense to have, rather than a singular definition, an understanding of multiple competing terms so that you can be intentional in language, but perhaps shift it when the shifts are necessary for some reason, whether tactical or based on the needs of people involved?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I was thinking the short answer is yes. But you have 35 minutes, so I can say more than just yes. I mean, I think, I was impressed by particularly the work that ISD did in doing a deep dive and looking at similarities and differences across multiple definitions. And to go back to your term you used, kind of the Venn diagram of what words are used multiple places. And even with looking at what words start to surface, in terms of commonalities, grievances. Grievance is a big piece across multiple definitions, it seems. But to the point made earlier about, ideology is present sometimes, not always. And so the idea that there could be a term that would be sort of fixed in time to some extent, all terminology has to be sort of a living terminology and change with the times, is probably fairly elusive. I mean, even in, again, going back to the field that I've spent most of my time on in mental health, and again, the pros and cons and struggles around the taxonomy, you're starting to see a move away from those kind of categorical definitions and moving more into kind of these matrices or these frameworks which look at not trying to come up with a categorical definition that covers an entire phenomenon, but it basically says, here are different pieces of that phenomenon, and depending on which pieces are present or absent, leads you towards a better understanding of the phenomenon you're trying to look at. And that seems to be, A, a trend. B, it seems to move away from some of the inherent problems of having a fairly more rigid categorical, because now you're basically allowing what I would consider much more helpful context-specific understandings of situations. So whether it's the shooting that you experienced, or the shooting in Las Vegas, or the shooting that was near where I lived in Highland Park, Illinois, on the 4th of July, you can begin to sort of look at those. There are similarities, but there are, from a contextual standpoint, key differences. Yeah. And that's how then the prevention piece and other pieces have to move forward with it.
And so I now want to take this idea of matrices of definitions rather than singular definitions and look at whether it might address some of the issues that have been put forward as related to having competing definitions. So I'll start with you, Brett, because you spoke about your dialogue with HHS when you were doing prevention work within the US government. And it sounds like this is almost exactly what you did, right? You understood that there were different ways to frame it in order to have a common dialogue. And so it was almost using a matrix style solution.
Yeah, it was finding the terms that resonated with communities and, frankly, code switching to use the vocabulary that worked best with those communities. I mean, even last week, I was on a call with the National Association of Elementary School Principals about Prevention Practitioners Network, and that's designed to prevent targeted violence and terrorism. He's like, terrorism is just distracting, so we're going to talk about targeted violence. I'm like, great. If you're willing to talk about targeted violence, that is the entry point for this call.
Yeah.
So it's not just the matrices of how do these definitions work, but also which terms are most functional for which purposes.
So to turn then to Björn, I'll get to you next, Richard, but you spoke about how it's important to understand people's needs, and that's part of what goes into fashioning a definition. So I'm kind of trying to look need by need here, so to speak. And so when we look at definitions being functional in that regard, does a matrix seem optimal for Eradicate Hate?
So Eradicate Hate is unique in that it's bringing together people from a vast array of different sectors, right? And so I think to some extent, matrix might be helpful for that and to acknowledge that everyone's coming to it from different backgrounds. However, in creating a shared language and understanding, it might actually, for the purposes of Eradicate Hate, be better to create a unified definition so that we know that within the context of this conference, we know that we're all talking about the same thing. And then on the basis of that, build out and say, this is the vast array of different approaches or different definitions that people who are working within this context comes from. But at the same time, when within this particular context, we have this shared understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So yes, and would be kind of the very complex answer to that one.
It's interesting, because obviously thus far, we've been operating at Eradicate Hate both last year and this year without a common definition. I think one question that could arise, I don't want to pose it quite yet, but has that produced functional problems? The yes and may well still be the exact right answer. But part of what we're looking to is what's our action coming out of this. Now, Richard, you've spoken about policy advocacy, moving the ball forward on multiple issues, and how taxonomy can either enhance those efforts or detract from those efforts. And I think that when we look at Eradicate Hate, part of what it is an activist organization, in the sense that the success or failure of the summit as an institution comes down to the question of, can it make the storm of hate that we face less? In the wake of the tragic Tree of Life shooting, can we make more people safe from attacks like that? So looking at your own struggles with taxonomy and trying to get it right, and seeing I think you used the term gun control movement, seeing the gun control movement, because he made a point that there were multiple definitions of what to call it. And within the gun control movement, you saw it stymied by that search. What would your recommendation as someone with a background in policy advocacy, activism, be to eradicate hate? For what's the next step we take with taxonomy?
So let me just put a pin on the map and tell you, we very purposely chose the term handgun control when we started the movement, because we wanted to separate the control of guns from the banning of guns. So that was a very intentional act. The other side turned it around on us and turned it into some anti-libertarian movement, but that was very purposeful. Words are incredibly powerful, and in a political context, when you're in the business of advocacy, you want to find the most powerful words, those words that capture the imagination and hopefully the anger and therefore the activism of the greatest number of people. So let me give you an example without having an answer to this. 2 shootings, all right? Shooting here at the Tree of Life, the 2 shootings, we talked about Las Vegas and sadly the one you were involved with. Does it make any difference to the public or to lawmakers or to the press if we call that a mass shooting versus an act of terrorism? I'd want to know that. as I was thinking about the language, I would want to know what resonates more powerfully with people. If I call it mass shootings, do I lose some segment of the population because they're worried about gun control? Whereas if I call it an act of terrorism, I capture a big swath of the population, and I can tie it into the whole movement across the country against terrorism, both international and domestic. Or do I then get hung up in the ideological discussion? I don't think you do when you're talking with the public. People know what terror means. When there were the bombings in New York, they knew that was an act of terror. Even more recently, the attacks in New York and New Jersey, people knew those were acts of terror. The people in Buffalo knew that was an act of terror. The people in Uvalde knew that was an act of terror. They knew it. And that's a powerful word. So we gravitate to the power, where we think the words are going to have the most impact. Now, let me give you an example of where this gets a little tricky.
Do you just want to respond?
The term eradicate hate, I'm a former prosecutor, leads me to think about crimes, right? Well, the one thing I would not like to see come out of this summit is that we start using the term hate to apply to a broad range of crimes, when there's been already so much work done around the notion of hate crimes. We now pretty well know what that means. And that's my other point, which is when you use these words in a consistent way, they tend to get a brand to them. Like the term hate crime, before we started introducing legislation to define hate crime, meant nothing, right?
Right.
It meant everything. Now it means something. So do no harm. I would not want to see us start talking about terrorism as hate crimes, because it would dilute all the very good work that's been put into the hate crime area, gender bias, racial bias, et cetera.
Right. I think that this is the case from both directions, right? That to use them as synonymous dilutes them both.
Right.
And one of the sort of reductio ad absurdum of the category expansion is that homicide by definition is a hate crime because you don't kill someone unless you hate them, right? And that's a place we wouldn't want to go at all. But Brett had a comment. I want to turn to Brett, and then there's an audience question that I want to get to after Brett responds here.
Well, I mostly want to engage with Richard. So apologies for lawyering for a second. One of the challenges...
Be careful when Brett starts to lawyer with you, because you're going to lose, no matter what.
Well, one of the challenges while I was at the Department of Justice was when you don't have a domestic terrorism charge, if you're using a firearm or a vehicle ramming incident versus explosives, so I'll set that aside for a second. When you don't have a domestic terrorism charge, prosecutors are reluctant to have events categorized as terrorism because they worry about prejudicing the jury pool. And in fact, Loretta Lynch was the first person in the aftermath of Charleston to say that white supremacy was the earliest form of terror in this country. She didn't call it terrorism, but she made a reference to terror. So the general public understands what terror is. They feel terrorized by acts like Uvalde or Las Vegas, even though there's no ideological underpinning, so it technically may not fit a government definition. How do we square that with the criminal code and lawyers' reluctance?
All right. I think you just gave another illustration to the point Jim made before you came in, which is there are going to be various levels of definitions depending on the user. He gave the example, is it the DSM? Mm-hmm. Yeah, of the DSM, where he said there are certain terms in mental health, and we all know what they are, that have very precise definitions, and I assume very precise diagnostic mechanisms. But you would not have to engage in that level of activity for the general public. I think it's the same answer. It actually is an interesting legal question as to whether or not you would get a negative inference from a judge, or you'd get an appellate ruling which said that the word domestic terrorism was overly prejudicial. I don't know if you would. I don't know if it's been tested. I think if you use it in the common meaning, you probably wouldn't. If you use it to denote some legal violation, you would, because there isn't one, as you say. So I think the question is always, who is the intended audience? Who are you trying to define this for? And again, I mean, you know this, but I deal at the societal level. I'm trying to advocate for the general public to move the society forward towards whatever goal it is we are pursuing. That's why we're always looking for the most impactful language.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I am going to try to wrap up by about 2:50, which means within about 6 or 7 minutes, just to keep everything on schedule throughout the day. The first one I'll take a crack at, and you can let me know if anyone disagrees. But as the working group considers the for whom, please help us to understand whether the taxonomy work is interested in broader public awareness, which is very different than interdepartmental conversations where the target audience is a known entity. And it seems like the answer here is both, right? We could consider the conference itself, the summit, to be the equivalent of interdepartmental, and we could consider the public to be a secondary audience. It seems like that clearly is what we're going for. So then turning to the second question, which is about hate versus terrorism. The question is, it is very apparent that the framing for REMV violence is hate. However, with Muslim and brown people, the label used is terrorism. Great damage has been done to minority communities and increased hate crimes against them because of the label. When does do no harm actually apply?
Great question.
Yeah, and so who wants to take a crack at that?
It's a great question. I'm
start?
sorry.
You can
I'm
go
sorry.
first.
I apologize.
Richard, then Bjorn.
Sorry. It's all about unforeseen circumstances, right? I constantly admonish my staff to think about unforeseen circumstances. And that's a great example. It's a great example and point taken. And you really have to try and think about these things before you start using these terms. So I actually don't want to comment beyond that. I take the point. It's a very good point.
Good.
It's a good point indeed, and one that I've dedicated a lot of thought to as well in terms of trying to figure out from a global perspective, being the international voice on the panel as well, like how do we define this in a way that makes sense not only in the Western world, or that makes even sense to the diverse communities that exist within the Western world. It's a challenge, and I think it's kind of also summarized in the intent of the summit being global. That is something that we need to address. We need to make sure that this our definition becomes something that is useful to all communities that are affected by hate. The question that we're grappling with there a little bit is also like, how do we segment between hate crime versus violent extremism versus terrorism? Now, the part of this is also building on my work with mapping hate internationally, and we've created a tool called the Global Hate Map, which is trying to grapple with this globally, and we're trying to grapple it with it beyond kind of the context of ideologies to some extent, but at the same time understanding that that is a factor. And so, again, back to the definition of violent extremism as the violent denial of diversity. Well, hate crimes as we view it, and I would disagree with you that that is a commonly understood term, because it's not within at least kind of reporting and police reporting on it, would be kind of violent denial of diversity targeting one individual or such. Like an act of terrorism would be direct violence against a larger group, etc. And so we've broken that down. But within that as well, you need to define what does diversity mean, what does violence mean, etc. And so it becomes kind of a house of cards of definitions building on top of each other as well. And then into that also putting how do we make sure that the violence that we're trying to prevent doesn't become a tool for executing violence against others. And so making a logically coherent system within which violence cannot be perpetrated on the basis of the definition itself, which is a challenge both when state actors and the lawyers are trying to define violent extremism in ways that make sense within their political context. I had experience living in Turkey for a while myself, and we ran into that issue. And so, there's challenges to be faced there as well.
And I think this is a good segue into the last question, and I'm going to do a lightning round on it.
Yeah.
This last question talks about, so it's a good segue because you talked about the house of cards of definitions, and your point was about how mind-bending it can be, and much of our discussion has been a little bit abstract. The last question is going to be about concretizing, and I'm just going to go on down in order. making you be relatively quick. To read the question, given the abstract nature of these concepts, what advice would you have for information professionals who are both constructing and operationalizing taxonomies and definitions of terrorism and violent extremism in particular organizational and business settings? So let's leave aside information professionals and let's just say professionals. Anybody who's working on these definitions, what do they need to do this well in a way that will have a positive impact? Jim, we'll begin with you.
That's a heck of a question. I think, I would go back to Jorn's comment. I would look at some of the work that's been done to try to tease out some of the commonalities across this crazy Venn diagram of language within these definitions. But I would also circle back around and think about the fundamental question of why are you trying to create a taxonomy and for what purpose? Yeah. What's the intent behind the search for the language? Is it policy? Is it advocacy? Is it marketing? Is it communicating to the general public? Is it speaking to clinicians? Because the intent behind the search, I think, will impact where that search takes you and what you factor in and what you rule out. So understanding the why question, I think, is critical. Why are you doing this?
Start with why.
Yes.
Brett.
Engage as many diverse stakeholders as possible, because the survivor perspective may be different from the industry perspective, may be different from different sectors, et cetera. So engage diverse stakeholders. And that is also my plea for all of you to help. This is a working group, not just a panel. So please, whoever asked the last question, which is extremely important, and anyone else who cares about this subject in this room, come forward after the panel and join this working group, because we do want as many diverse perspectives in the stakeholder conversation as possible.
Wonderful. Good advice. Richard.
Given that this is a lightning round, I'll say this. My view is always to have as broad a definition as you can that maintains integrity, and only put restrictions on that definition if they serve some substantial meaning. So it's as broad as you can, but restrict it only if those restrictions really matter.
Bjorn.
So I think building on that, figuring out what is the kind of reverse pyramid funnel of definitions that we want to apply to target this specific community and the specific needs of the conference itself might be a way we can create like a menu basically of, if you are doing this, these are the things you should consider, this might be an applicable definition. And so that doesn't answer the question at all, but it might be a way forward for us as a working group.
So taxonomy matters, right? It matters on multiple levels. It matters to victims. It matters to communities. It matters from a prosecutorial perspective, from a systemic perspective. On this panel, I think there's a partial rejection of the search for universal definitions, in part because sometimes the needs of one particular community or organization will differ from another. At the same time, perhaps there's a benefit to a search for them anyway, as Bjorn and others have hinted at. So I think what we can commit to as a deliverable, since they want a deliverable from every panel, is either creation of or else identification of a matrix, right? The definitions that are employed by different institutions, because that at least can allow the summit to speak intentionally with the language that it uses by seeing what is out there and what is available as we try to make sure that there's a common vocabulary to the summit. Everyone here is nodding. We have our deliverable. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. Colin Clark, who showed up on video mysteriously about 10 minutes ago. Wonderful to see you, our original moderator. But as was said at the very beginning, even though this is the least sexy of the panel titles, I hope that this is something that was useful to everybody, because the search ultimately for a common vocabulary and to make sure that we're using terms in ways that are understood should be important to all of us. Thank you.